Well, good evening. You can still continue to drink. It's okay. In fact, sometimes people have said that the more you drink, the more you learn from my lectures. I don't know if that's true or not, but we can take a quiz afterwards. You know, I once had a professor tell me way back in college that the average length of time that any given person could listen intently to anyone speaking was about 7 minutes. So I have a request that, we take that cumulative 7 minutes and kind of break it up so that at any given moment someone will be paying attention. So I want to assign someone, you can have the very last minute of the lecture. So I know that someone will be listening at that point. You can have 30 seconds here and 45 seconds over there, and then we'll try to get done. Well, I'm Michael Duty. I'm the Director of American Western Art here at Heritage Auction Galleries. We're delighted that you're with us. We hope you also come back on Saturday when we have our auction of Art of the American West and Texas art. We'll start with Texas art around 1 o'clock, and then by 3 o'clock we'll be moving into the Western art section. Beer and barbecue at noon. You'll notice that we have strategically scheduled it so that the beer comes before the bidding. Another experiment, and if it works well, we'll continue to do that. Tonight, this evening, we're going to talk about Western art, perhaps from a little different perspective than maybe some of you associate with that subject, and maybe some of you don't. So afterwards, I'd be happy to stick around and talk with you and answer any questions and talk about kind of the idea of Western art in general. I've been working with this subject for about 30 years now. And I remember the first time that I really ever thought sort of seriously about what Art of the American West was all about was when I was in college. And I had a professor who came in and did a little slideshow. That was when you actually had to have slides to look at images rather than digital images. It was a lot more difficult then. He did a slideshow on Frederick Remington and Charlie Russell, which are, of course, the two names that most people connect with Western art in general. And if you haven't heard of any other Western artists, you probably have heard at least of those two. And as I was looking at that, it occurred to me that I was living in a western state, Texas. I was living in a city, but actually I was living in Wichita Falls at the time, which is just almost in Oklahoma, and you can almost tell. There's some rub off there. So I had a lot of access to what one might think of as a Western lifestyle. I had people that I'd known and I'd grown up with who had worked on ranches and had spent a great deal of their time around the subject matter that Remington and Russell had been painting, 100 years earlier than that. And it struck me that there didn't seem to be a lot of similarities between what I was seeing in painting and what I was seeing in real life in terms of the West. So I became very interested in the differences between Western art and Western reality. And I think in that 30 years or so that difference may have sort of closed the gap a little bit. So today I really want to talk about modern interpretations of the West, interpretations of the West from, say, the early to mid part of the 20th century right on up until today. So we're going to see images of artists that are working right now, that are probably in the the prime of their career, some that have sort of just ended that career, because we are an auction company and because we are in the business of giving you the opportunity to become a Western art collector. We will see things in this presentation that are also on the walls. So when you see one of those images, we hope that it sort of burns in your heart a burning desire to go buy it. So we're not going to make any pretense about that whatsoever. Our desire here is for you to buy art. But if you can't buy art, at least you can have a good time coming and watching other people do that and learning a little bit about it also. So let's start. So the title is Cadillacs to, or Cattle Drives to Cadillacs, Contemporary Visions of the American West. And that's really why we titled it Contemporary Visions and of the American West. I'm often asked, really, how do you define American Western art? You know, what constitutes Western art? And if I were to ask you tonight, I had given you probably a questionnaire and said, okay, you give me 5 images right away from American Western art, I could almost predict what you would probably say in terms of majority. Somebody's going to say cowboys, for certain. Someone's going to say Indians. And we have to be very, very, very careful. You have to have, paintings of cowboys doing cowboy things and paintings of Indians doing Indian things. You do not want cowboys doing Indian things and Indian things doing cowboy things. That kind of muddies the issue. Someone's going to say a stagecoach. Someone's going to say a cavalry charge. Probably someone will talk about the landscape itself. And actually, that sums up a lot of the subject matter. If I were to narrow it down to 3 particular subjects, I would say the Native Americans, I would say the land itself, which would include animals, and then what you might call sort of the grand adventure and drama of what the West is all about. And that's what really kind of translated into movies and television. Cowboys, cattle drives, kind of the general spirit of the West. But I wanted to look at maybe some different images tonight also and kind of give you an idea of the breadth of Western art. And then at the end, maybe we can sort of redefine what's Western art and why we actually say art of the American West. So let's start with a very traditional image, an artist named Bob Hummel, who lives down in Kerrville, Texas, and who specializes in painting and actually a very important historic era, but one that was fairly short-lived. And that was that time between right after the Civil War until about 1885, 1890, when there were all of these free-ranging cattle down in South Texas. There were great burgeoning centers of population in the east and the north. They were all hungry. They needed beef. Texans had beef, but they had no way to get them to market. So what was born was the cattle drive. And that was when, these young men, many of them who were probably below 20, well below 20, sort of invented themselves, and the whole idea of the American cowboy was born. But again, by 1885, 1890, even in Texas, most of the ranch land was fenced. Railroads were then kind of brought down to the south, and then you would not have to have these cattle drives anymore. But the figure of the cowboy was formed. It's probably the most popular image. I would say Western art, but it might be one of the most popular images in American art in general. And Bob Hummel is a man who's painting today, but is actually concentrating in that sort of narrow range of Western history. Now, there are other artists that take another look at the West. This is an artist named Bill Schenck. Bill Schenck has an interesting sense of humor also. About 10 years ago, he started billing himself as not Bill Schenck. It used to be, first it was Billy Schenck, then it was Bill Schenck, and then it was William Clinton Schenck. And I'm really not sure if Clinton was really his first name or not, or his middle name, but Bill really kind of takes the idea of American pop art and then moves that into the Western field. And so then you have this painting of what looks like almost like a young Robert Redford figure and painted in front of this Cadillac, and everything is kind of bleached out in this very sort of white light of the West. So you get 2 real different interpretations of what the West is all about. One is sort of the iconography of sort of the home territory of Western art, and the other one is a more ironic sense of what the West is all about. Another guy that would do that is a man named Larry Perney. And Larry Perney is a Montana artist who grew up fascinated with Western movies and Western television. He's told me that he spent hours upon hours at home. He'd come home after school and turn on television. There was Dale Evans and Roy Rogers and Gene Autry. And so he started creating these sort of almost, again, sort of pop images. This is actually papier-mâché. This is about as big as I am. And it's a work that actually kind of comes out from the walls. So you can't really tell it here, but there's a three-dimensional element of this. And you'll also see right up in here what would almost be a cloud, but also in some of his paintings, he actually puts captions up here and that sort of thing. Again, very much like a Roy Lichtenstein or somebody of that era. So you got three really kind of different images of the West. And then you have this persistent, or I would probably say rather than persistent, an enduring legacy of artists who have looked at the West really as it is today. So you've got, kind of popular culture here, historic art here, and then here is a man named Tom Ryan. Tom Ryan is now probably in his 90s. He spent a good portion of his career painting on a ranch called the Four Sixes. Anybody ever heard of the Four Sixes? You probably have. If you're this close to Fort Worth and this close to Wichita Falls and the Panhandle, the Four Sixes is one of the great ranches in Texas. And Tom Ryan spent probably 40 years on and off the Four Sixes painting day in, day out, got to be very close to the men who worked there. Certainly was somebody that they respected and they welcomed into their environment. So he would ride along with them. He didn't work as a cowboy, but he certainly painted. So everybody you see in a Tom Ryan painting is a real person. Everybody there is somebody that he knows, somebody that he has portrayed, and he's very much in taking a look at how Western traditions have endured into the present. Now, let's go back about 100 years from Tom Ryan. This is an artist by a man named artist named Chester Loomis. This is called Antelope Hunters in San Angelo. This was painted in the 1870s. So there were artists actually in Texas in the 1870s and prior to that who were looking at Western subjects. This happens to be Chester Loomis. This is his brother. And we won't go into the sibling rivalry there, but he seemed to be quite relaxed. Well, this guy is hard at work. His brother was the ranch manager, and Charles Orchester was the visiting rancher or visiting artist. So this is the kind of image you could see out in the middle of West Texas at that time. And another artist who came to Texas on a frequent basis was Frank Tenney Johnson, who was very well known throughout the country, primarily known for his nocturnals, and this is one of those. This is a ranch foreman on a ranch in West Texas also. Since we're in Texas and we're in Dallas, I tried to find as many Texas-based paintings or Texas-based painters as I could, because I also wanted you to realize that Texas is also a Western art state. Oftentimes when we talk about Texas art, we don't really associate it with Western art, but there's a long-standing tradition in that. Here's one of your little stories that you can leave tonight. One of the things that you'll be able to take with you is that this is my present to you. There's going to be a time, probably within the next year or so, that you're going to be at a cocktail party, and there's going to be a lull in the conversation. And you're going to wonder what you could come up with to interest somebody at that point, to break that sort of awkward silence. You know when you're looking around, you're moving your glass from one hand to the other, and you're hooking it behind your belt. So you could say, there was an artist named Frank Tenney Johnson, and he has a very good lesson about really knowing who your host is. Because Frank Tenney Johnson went to a cocktail party, and he kissed his host, and discovered that she had meningitis, and he died a little bit after that. So the rest of the evening, you will have no trouble making conversation. Or people will leave you, and at that point, you won't have to make conversation anyway. So that's a little gem for you tonight. While Frank Tenney Johnson and Charles Loomis were painting these sort of traditional images of the West, that could have come right out of Remington and Russell's sketchbook, there was another group of artists that are very, very important to the development of Western art for a lot of different reasons. One, they were very good artists, But for another is that prior to them, Western art was kind of all about those traditional images. Cowboys and Indians, cattle drives, things that you probably could see later in movies. This is a group called the Taos Society of Artists, and there were either 8 or 10 or 12, depending on who you talk to, as to how they started. But they were all artists that were very classically trained. Most of them were either trained in the academies of the Midwest in Chicago. Most of them went to Paris and Munich to hone their craft. They were studio painters, and they sort of gathered together over the years in Taos, New Mexico, primarily for 2 or 3 different reasons. One, the light of the area was certainly beckoning to artists. There were also these 3 distinct cultures who had lived side by side for centuries, the Anglo, the American Indian, and the Hispanic, and you didn't really see that any other place in the country at the time. So there was this wonderful kind of subject matter for artists, and also it was a very inexpensive place to live at the time. If you've looked at real estate in Taos or Santa Fe recently, that's no longer the case, but at that time it really was. An artist could live here very comfortably and look out their front door and have ample material for their art. Now, a lot of them painted very traditional images. This is an E.I. Cowes painting, which is called The Apprentice. It's in the Rockwell Museum in Corning, New York. And it's mostly historically authentic. I say mostly. Everything in the painting is authentic. At the time, although there were a lot of male potters now, there weren't any male potters at that point. But what the Cowes artists would do, they would gather together these models around them, and they would produce these images, and gradually the idea of what a Native American was greatly expanded. For the first 50 to 60 years, most people, when they saw an image of American Indians after 1830, thought of Plains Indians. They thought of Indians with headdresses, they thought of Indians on horses, they thought of buffalo hunts. That's all primarily because the first artists to paint Native Americans went up the Missouri River into the Upper Rockies, and those were the images that they brought back. When the Taos artists began, congregating in northern New Mexico and painting images like this, they started painting Native Americans who had been in the same place for 300, 400, 500 years. They were Native Americans who had a very agrarian existence. They were Native Americans who were involved in art. So the idea of what a Native American was all about changed dramatically once the Taos Society of Artists started painting and got popular. They also painted the life around them. Just like Tom Ryan was painting the people on the 4-6's ranch, this is an E. Martin Hennings painting called The Twins. And these were 2 handymen that traveled up and down northern New Mexico, actual guys that existed. There's another painting just like this where one's on the wagon and one's on the ground. It's the only 2 that I know of. So you had this kind of work, but gradually these artists kind of started exploring some other facets of life around them. So a different, more enlarged picture of the American West started to emerge. One of the artists that I think did probably more than anybody else to expand that image was a man named Walter Ufer. And this is a painting from the National Cowboy and Western Heritage Museum, and it's called Sleep. And one of the interesting things about it is that Ufer primarily painted the people around him. He didn't paint the great adventurers. He didn't paint Native Americans hunting buffalo or having war raids or being on their ponies. He painted them in sort of ordinary, different pursuits among the things that they had made. He was very, very interested in the idea of labor and the sort of whole idea of just people working, what they did with their hands. And he also produced in the early 1930s and 1940s images that artists heretofore never painted in terms of Western art. You would never see a broken down jalopy with a mechanic and his friend sitting there on the side of the road. There wasn't a subject that you would have seen 20 years earlier or even during this time. There's everything we're going to see tonight, because we don't have enough time. And I was told you give about a minute per slide, and I was thinking that we didn't want to end at 1 in the morning, so I edited down a lot of stuff for you. You'll thank me later if not already. Uh, there's a parallel movement going on in Western art in general, and that is, you have all of the illustrators like N.C. Wyatt and Frank Schoonover and all of that Brandywine River group. They kind of inherited the mantle of Frederick Remington and Charles Russell, and they were the ones that were producing the sort of grand adventure of the West. So we're going to see the alternative to that. Now this one is a Walter Ooper called Hunger. And so if you start with Ooper and sort of his very early career, and you see this kind of traditional images of Native Americans at work and in their daily activities, and then you sort of get to the end of his career where he's really sort of now looking at themes, and he's looking at more of the emotional side, or what sort of New Mexico can symbolize. And I think this is a wonderful painting just in general, and I love the title because it's very evocative. I mean, it's hunger for real sustenance, or is it hunger for spirituality? We really don't know. It's something that you bring that to the painting. The artist gives you the raw material, and then you do the rest in terms of interpretation. Now, even artists that were a little more traditional in subject matter, like W.H. Dunton, also were looking at the West with a fresh set of eyes. And so you start seeing different perspectives. You see the perspective of someone who's, very high up looking down on the subject matter. So you get this kind of general panorama there. And also you start seeing how they start blending the forms of the Native Americans and the horses and the land itself, and also repeating all of these different colors, so that you get this kind of grand image of the West, which is universal in one sense, but also very, very specific in another. Ernest Blumenschein, probably another artist that pushed that limit or that boundary as much as anybody. And you can also see how, if you start here with the figures, and you kind of break this up with Taos Pueblo, and then the mountains back here really sort of mimic the shapes of the figures or vice versa, and you'll also get this great kind of atmosphere and storm clouds over there. I mean, I'm sure most of you have been probably to New Mexico, and a lot of times when people are just looking at that art, they say, well, clouds don't look that way in Connecticut, but they do look that way in New Mexico. And I think this is something that these artists discovered was it's a whole new landscape, a whole new way of looking at things. Now, he also did more traditional images, but even this one, takes the subject and puts it right up in front of the viewer, so that you've got a different kind of perspective, almost breaking the plane of the painting itself. And finally, this was in the last year of Blumenschein's life. This is called The Chief Goes Through, and you really get, if you're familiar with the work of Charles Sheeler, you almost get, sort of industrial America in terms of a Western image. I think it's very appropriate that Blumenschein would have painted this because, after all, it was the Santa Fe Railroad that brought most of these artists to the West in general. And the Santa Fe Railroad, which is now Burlington Northern Santa Fe, would often give artists blank canvases in exchange for a trip out west. They would paint, bring them back, and that's how they would finance their way out there. So you have Blumenschein, who is sort of pushing that notion of what the West is all about into a more modern interpretation. Well, there were a lot of other artists that were not associated with the Taos Society of Artists who were now coming into New Mexico primarily. Artists from a very, very different background, but who still found this land extremely compelling and really inspirational in terms of their own work. Here's an artist, Marsden Hartley, who is known for paintings in Germany, known for paintings in Maine, comes to New Mexico and paints what he calls earth-cooling New Mexico. This is in the Amon Carter Museum collection. He was not a fan of the Taos Society of Artists. He has these wonderful letters where he has some very colorful descriptions of how bad they are in terms of artists. And they actually shared his animosity for him also. So that wasn't a happy, relationship there. But he's an important artist because he did come and he actually started sort of bringing together these trends in modern American art and moving those into the idea of the West and interpreting the West. This is simply called Sombrero. Other artists painting at the same time. Stuart Davis went to Santa Fe in New Mexico on numerous occasions. John Marin. Now again, these are not paintings that were done in 1970. These are paintings that were done in the early part of the 20th century. They had a tremendous effect on the whole idea that the West was something you couldn't just display in one way. It was more than cowboys. It was more than Indians. It was a place. It was also an idea. It was also colors and form and texture. And the same sort of things and the same techniques that would apply to someone painting in the East also applied to painting in the West. How did this affect the artists that were living in Taos, those artists that had formed the Taos Society of Artists? We'll get to that question in just a moment. But first, we'll look at a painting. Is there anybody here who doesn't know who this artist is? All right, we'll go on then. George O'Keeffe, of course. George O'Keeffe actually came west and started teaching in Canyon, Texas. And you may have seen some of those early watercolors and went out to Mexico and then painted things like this. And, of course, one of her famous quotes is that if you don't understand the cross, you really don't understand New Mexico. So she was really after the natural land itself, but also the culture of Santa Fe and New Mexico and Abiquiu where she lived. Now, the artist that I was going to talk about just a minute ago about how did George O'Keeffe and John Marin and Stuart Davis and Marsden Hartley affect these artists who had been working and living in Santa Fe and Taos? One of those artists was Victor Higgins, who also has a strong Texas connection. He was married to Marion Kugler McNay for a while, and that's where the San Antonio Museum is named for. One of his early paintings was actually commissioned by the city of Amarillo. This is Paladuro Canyon. And at this point, I don't think you would call him a real traditional artist, but he still was working in a very representational manner. And as he associates with these other new artists that are coming into the West, his art begins to change a little bit. This is a typical landscape, and you can see that it's moving away from sort of literal translations of the land, almost now into an area where you're getting into not abstraction, but certainly a different way of portraying the land itself in a less realistic manner, but still representational. So finally you get something like this, which is even really pushing beyond what Blumenschein was doing. This is a funeral service here, and you kind of see that reflected in these great colors and swaths of storms and things and the trees down here. So finally, at the very end of his life, he would go out into the desert. He had an old car. He would pop the back trunk when they actually had sizable trunks at that time. And there are these wonderful pictures of him sitting out in the desert, sitting in the trunk of his car with an umbrella, propped up on it, and he has a lap easel, and he's painting. He calls these his little gems. They're about this big. And then he would go back into the town square in Taos, and he would park on the square, and he would sell these. And I think he was getting around $150 at the time. If any of you have relatives that bought one of those paintings, please see us at the end of this lecture. We will give you 10 times what you paid for it. So. Now, those artists, Victor Higgins and those other artists, again, we're looking at 1930s all the way to the 1950s. They began having an effect on other artists in other locations that are painting the West. And the reason I'm really trying to show these to you is to show that everything that's happening really in American art in general is also being reflected in those artists who interpret the West. Here's an artist that maybe a lot of you probably know, Alexander Hogue. Alexander Hogue was an early member of the Dallas Nine, or 10 or 11 or 12, depending on who you talk to. And, of course, he's painting allegorical landscapes. He's painting during the Dust Bowl, during the years when people start understanding what over-farming of a particular area is doing to the land. And this is his interpretation of that. And although it's very allegorical, has a very pointed political message, I find it very similar to what a lot of those New Mexico artists were doing. Jerry Bywaters, another Dallas artist, who has some Western images. You don't normally think about Bywaters as a Western image. But you know, this is the West that Bywaters was living into. This is called Oilfield Girls. This is one of my favorite paintings. And you know it's Western because he's got boots on. So, but also this is what happens in that area, you know, where all of his artists would go out earlier and they'd paint the scenes of the cattle drives and the cowboy life. Well, this is the modern manifestation of what West Texas was all about. Other artists, Leonard Baskin, not necessarily known as a Western artist, but he did this wonderful, powerful series of images. This is his image of Sitting Bull. He also did one of Custer, which you probably have seen that Custer one. You would recognize it if I had the slide. Fritz Scholder, who is the first artist tonight who we've seen, it's a Native American, who taught at the Institute of American Indian Arts back in Santa Fe. So now you're looking at the 1960s and 1970s, and you're looking at a very different way of looking at Native America. One of Fritz's students was a man named T.C. Cannon. Anybody ever heard of T.C. Cannon? T.C. Cannon was sort of the James Dean of Native American artists. He died at a very early age. He had a car accident, much like Dean on a sports car. T.C. Cannon had been a paratrooper in Vietnam. He was decorated many times for service there. Came back and studied art in Santa Fe, and studied under Fritz Scholder. Eventually came back and took Scholder's place. He was also an artist who had a sense of humor. He went to Europe and he studied there, and he went to all of the great museums. And you'll notice up here he's got his Van Gogh on the wall of this Kiowa Indian who's dressed in his sort of finery and in kind of a very sort of curious pose for a Native American. I find it very interesting that Native American artists in the 1960s, 70s, and on today are doing things like this and this, while Anglo artists are doing things like this. This is by a man named Roy Anderson, who's a very fine, wonderful painter, and also is very interested in Southern Plains culture. You see a lot of Northern Plains culture painted, but this is Southern Plains. This is Comanche and Apache and Kiowa. And you also notice that while this is very realistic here, the background is very much abstract. And so you have those kind of two sort of interests culminating in one painting. On one side of that spectrum is Martin Greeley, who is an artist who now lives in Clifton, Texas. Actually grew up in Clifton, Texas, and does paintings like this, which, by the way, is for sale in our next auction, called Cheyenne Pride. And Martin has become one of the more popular painters of traditional Native American life. Another artist who precedes Martin into the cowboy artists of America is a man named Ken Riley, who takes Native American culture and kind of presents it in sort of a different, more, I think, interesting in terms of design. Ken is very interested in composition and design. For instance, like this. You'll notice the way that the tree back here is sort of reflective of the Native American and the pony here. So sort of an interesting way of looking at different sort of things. John Coleman, also a contemporary artist. You'll notice, the more discerning and the audience probably have noticed the pattern so far. We're doing non-traditional and traditional. So, and then I'm going to change that in a minute and just thoroughly confuse you again. But got to keep you on your toes. And remember, your assignment, the last minute, you have to be rapt attention. I know, because I could see that you were kind of varying there, and you were saving your minute. But that's okay. John Coleman actually produced a whole series of bronze portraits which are based on Carl Bodmer's work. So he's gone back to the very earliest images of American Indians and started producing these. This slide does not do justice to this work. It's about this big, and it's just a remarkable piece. Glenna Goodacre, though, is an artist who has Dallas roots, splits her time between Dallas and Santa Fe, and is sort of like those earlier Taos artists. She's looking at Native Americans today, and this is one of her life-size statues of a mother and daughter, very evocative. Bruce Green, another Texas artist, is an artist that goes up to the J.A. Ranch, which is not that far from the 4 Sixes, and one of the few ranches that still does almost everything in a traditional way. They still drive cattle pretty much the same way. They're not using pickup trucks and helicopters. You know, they're out with the remuda and catching the horses and actually pretty much the same way it would have been done back in Frank Ray's day. Bob Hummel, again, we started out with Bob Hummel, and he also takes a look at the way sort of Texas developed in the early part of the 19th century. This is called Castroville, and this little inn still exists, so you can still go down there and stay in it. This is Gordon Snidow, another contemporary cowboy, so you still have the historic look, and then cowboys today. There's an interesting story about this painting, though. If you look real carefully here, you know, you may see a little separation between the bench that the cowboy is sitting on and the windmill. This windmill is actually in the Panhandle Plains History Museum. The cowboy is not. At least not that I've seen him there anyway. What Snidow did is he found a sort of typical cowboy in Ruidoso, New Mexico, and painted him. And then he saw this wonderful windmill, which he loved the design. And so he just simply put those things together and created the cowboy sitting up there. I hope I haven't destroyed any illusions, but sometimes artists will do this. So you can't always trust the fidelity of what they do in terms of a living. And with Gordon Snidow, that's particularly true. So never pay too much attention to what an artist is telling you. But then he told me this story, so who knows? Back to Bill Schenck. I had to have at least 2 Cadillacs because I got more than one cattle drive, so I had to have 2 Cadillacs to it. Now we even have a different way and a modern way of looking at cowgirls. This is an artist named Donna Howe Sickles. Donna lives just up the road from us and just opened a gallery in St. Joe, Texas. And when, I think the story, you may have read this in one of our catalogs, she was an art student at Texas Tech, and she came across in one of the flea markets an old postcard, one of the old postcards from the 20s or 30s, and it was of cowgirls. And she was so sort of fascinated with this spirit that she saw of an actual photograph of these cowgirls, that she slowly began incorporating that into her work. And now almost everything she does are these pictures of cowgirls, but they also very much relate to her sort of interest in mythology. So there's always a lot of animals. And the thing I love about Donna Howe Sickles' work is that there's a joy to it. I mean, you look at it and it's like everybody's having a good time. And so there's just this kind of sense of energy and real sort of joy for life in it, which I think is great. This one is simply called Apples. This one is also in our sale. Now, I wanted to focus on a couple of artists real closely here because I want to let you know that just because an artist paints one way doesn't mean it is necessarily different from an artist who paints in a completely different way. This is an artist named Wayne Bays, and Wayne Bays lives out near Fort Davis, Texas, way out in the Davis Mountains. He is probably as close to being self-sustaining as any artist that I know. I mean, he raises livestock, he grows his food. He's got, I think, 6 or 7 kids, and they all participate in the ranch life. They all work together. And so what Wayne paints is pretty much what Wayne lives. And so these images that you see are not Wayne going on to somebody else's ranch. It's really what he does on a daily basis. And so he takes a look that's very true traditional. I apologize for the kind of curve of the page here. And the idea is that, he really doesn't have to do a lot of research because really he sees this on a daily basis. Now, there's another artist who lives in Montana who has a very, very similar lifestyle. His name is Theodore Waddell, and he paints primarily the animals that are on his ranch in Montana. And all of those animals that he paints are the animals that he knows, he sees every day, he raises them. He also, like Wayne Bays, is very self-sufficient, and he's very much a working cowboy. And he's not a working cowboy because he thinks it's adventurous or it's romantic. He's a working cowboy because you have to work the land that you live on in order to survive. So this is the way that Wayne Bayes portrays that land, and this is the way that Theodore Waddell portrays that land. These artists are almost the same age, and they've almost been working at about the same length of time, but they have very, very different interpretations and very different ways of expressing themselves. These are very, very large paintings and are just sort of wonderful examples of color. Now, other artists are going to take a look in the modern way of, very much focusing in on sort of the accoutrements of the West. This is an artist named Bill Acheff, who's very, very popular and also almost always pays homage to the earlier artists that have gone by. So you're always going to see something. These are, very much Trompe-l'oeil paintings. You'll always see something, some element that reflects an artistic tradition in almost all of his work. Another artist, a man named Kyle Posen, takes that same kind of interpretation and puts it into a much more sort of Western format. So his still lifes are much more in terms of sort of cowboy life. And you see those. These are paintings. These are not photographs. I want to spend a little time on that other great theme in Western art, which is the land itself. And there are many, many different ways of portraying life on the range. There are many, many different ways of portraying the grandeur and the beauty of the West. This is by Jim Wilcox. It's out on the hallway. This is a wonderful painting by Kurt Walters, probably one of the better landscape painters working today at Grand Canyon. This is a little bit different. This is by Merrill Mahaffey. And Merrill Mahaffey, this is kind of an unusual painting for him because from a perspective, you get a little distance from what he's painting. A lot of his work is like this. I mean, it's like you've got Jim Wilcox with a great panorama, and you've got Merrill Mahaffey who gets about 5 inches away from the rock face and paints, the strata and the striations and the colors of the land, the way it looks that close. This is a guy named Ken Holder, who is a Midwesterner and started traveling to the West. And he said the first thing he noticed was that unlike walking through, say, grasslands in Illinois, if you walk barefoot through Arizona, you better put your shoes back on. And he said, there's so many things out there that can prick you or stick you or stab you. He was very interested in the different textures of the West. So what he does, he paints the painting, and then he frames it with another painting which is all about texture. So this is built up about 3 inches. And you have some sort of very interesting juxtaposition of the image and then also the kind of texture. It will be a conservator's nightmare at some point, but right now it's okay. Ed Mell is another artist who sort of harkens back to earlier days, very much kind of Maynard Dixon-like. He's one of my favorite artists. I think that it's interesting to have an artist who can evoke energy and drama and adventure with no figures. And with Ed Mell, it's all about weather. It's about weather and it's about change. And you see all of these great, clouds and this wonderful, maybe it's just me, I love thunderstorms. And so when I see that, I think it's a great evocation of that. Wilson Hurley, probably the preeminent landscape painter of the 20th century, did these wonderful versions of the cliff dwellings. Another Texas artist named Nancy Bush kind of almost goes back to a tonalist approach, particularly in this one, which is a wonderful little painting that we just recently sold. And Michael Eddy, an artist in Austin, who I think is a great, he's about my age, so he's no youngster. But I think he's really, really kind of a very interesting artist, works a lot in watercolors and pastels. Louise McElhaney has lots of paint and, really kind of gets a lot of energy and the amount of paint that she puts in. These are all different ways that contemporary artists are essentially looking at the same subject, but they're looking at it and presenting it in a little bit different way. Gary Ernest Smith is an artist who grew up in Utah, spent some time in Oregon, driving back and forth between those two places. He started noticing that, more and more all of the farmland was being eaten up with new developments, houses and Walmarts and strip malls. And so what he wanted to do was he wanted to take a look at farmland. So he produced a series of paintings, what he simply called fields. And it was actually a single field throughout the entire year, 12 months. And this is right after they'd cut the hay. Back to our favorite setting in New Mexico, Walt Gonski takes an almost very impressionistic looking at that, and compare that to Kim Wiggins, who is a very sort of fanciful, almost Thomas Hart Benton-like version of a very similar scene. Very, very, I think these artists are always, you can see their individuality, you can see their personalities through this. Nancy Glazer, who is very well known for very precise and realistic depictions of animals, which she calls basically her right-hand paintings, and she calls this her left-hand paintings, which I think she actually paints with her left hand. I'm not sure, but I think that she does. And then she, almost like that Ernest Blumenstein, where the figures become part of the landscape. I think that's a really interesting painting. Same subject by a Native American artist named Tex Wounded Face. I don't know a lot about Tex Wounded Face, but I love his name. So I always try to work it in any lecture that I can. Sometimes it's a little bit difficult, but you got to get him in there because, what kind of name is that? Steve Kestrel is one of my favorite artists who works in bronze and stone, and you can't quite see it, but this is a snake, and right here is a tail. And if you turn this around, there is a field mouse going down that way. So what you've got is a snake going up one way, and then he's going to go down the other side. So pretty clever and sort of a nice imagination. Grant Speed, born in Texas around San Angelo. I wanted to show you that in spite of all of these other interpretations of the West, we still have these traditionalists. We still have these people that are working today, and they're producing wonderful examples. But as a modern artist, you can also see the engineering on bronzes has gotten to be pretty sophisticated, where you can have these animals that are almost sort of sprung out there in midair. Tim Cox, which the painting is right out here in the hallway, is a new member of the Cowboy Artists of America. And, you can't do a lecture on traditional Western art without a picture of a dog. So that's one we have tonight. I happen to like the dog, so I put that in. Howard Post is another contemporary artist, paints traditional subjects but from a very different perspective. So you've got the Western working landscape here, and then the great untouched Western landscape here, and then the road kind of leading your eye back this way. I think he's a very interesting artist. This is his perspective on cattle. And then this painting, a very similar painting to this, was just purchased by the Phoenix Art Museum. Again, that perspective I think is very, very interesting, where you get the working area, kind of the civilized West, or the working West, and then the natural West out here. This next artist is an artist I've just come across recently, and I really have to admit that I'm really sort of smitten by her work. I just think it's very evocative, and it's very kind of subtle in some ways, but also it's kind of in your face and bold. So I want to see kind of what you think about it. This is Teresa Elliott. And what I think is interesting about that is if you look at this painting closely, you see a tremendous variety of colors in the horns and in the face, and it's just a very kind of dramatic, I think a very dramatic sort of, and also, and certainly an icon of the West. And then this one, I think it's just this great personality of this animal. And also, just so you won't think we're looking at only sort of masculine subjects, we always have this also. So what you see is that, what I hope you see anyway, is that the art of the American West is more than American Western art. It's more than just sort of shoot-'em-ups on a Saturday morning, or driving cattle from one place to the other. All valid subjects and all interesting subjects that can be looked at in a variety of ways. But the art of the American West is really about an idea. And the idea is that this area of the country has such numerous and varieties of facets in life and customs and traditions, and also our artistic traditions, that it's a very, very big place, not just physically, but also metaphorically. And so that the idea is that the art of the American West can encompass so much more than a cowboy on a bucking bronco, which is a good subject, but it's not the only subject. So, how is Western art going to progress? Well, we'll just have to take that road when we come to it. This is a Woody Gwynn painting, and I think probably that's the best image I can think of in terms of the modern West, which is the open road. And whatever is right around that bend, we don't know yet, but an artist is going to be there interpreting it. So thank you for coming tonight. I enjoyed it. Hope you did.